He signed it. My brother-in-law actually signed it. He didn't read it. He didn't pause. He just grabbed the pen like he always grabbed everything that belonged to someone else, fast, careless, and completely certain that whatever he was taking had no real value. That signature cost him $460,000, and it gave me back everything my mother meant to leave me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It was a Tuesday in November. I know it was Tuesday because I had just come off a double shift at the accounting firm. And Tuesdays were always the day my supervisor scheduled the client review calls back to back. The ones that ran 40 minutes over and left you with a tension headache sitting right behind your left eye. I was 28 years old. I had a thermos of lukewarm coffee in my hand, and I was standing on the front step of the house I had grown up in, fumbling for my key, when the door opened before I could touch it. My sister stood in the doorway. Not in her own house, in mine. In the house my mother had left to both of us. She was wearing a new coat. Camel-colored wool, the kind that costs more than a month of groceries. She had a moving box tucked under one arm, and my mother's old ceramic lamp tucked under the other. That lamp had been on my nightstand since I was 7 years old. I said her name. I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "Oh good, you're home. We need to talk." She said we. That was the first warning I didn't pay enough attention to. My name is Rachel. My sister's name is Dana. We are 3 years apart, and for most of our lives, people who didn't know us well assumed we were close. We looked alike. We had the same laugh. We both got our mother's stubborn streak and our father's way of going very quiet when something was wrong. But Dana married my brother-in-law when I was 22, and something shifted after that. My brother-in-law had opinions, strong ones, about money, about property, about which members of Dana's family were useful and which ones were, in his words, dead weight. I learned early on which category he had put me in. My mother got sick the winter I turned 26. It was a slow decline, the kind that teaches you things about yourself you weren't ready to know. I took the bereavement leave. I drove her to appointments in Mississauga. I sat with her in the evenings when Dana was too busy, when my brother-in-law had some networking event or some dinner that couldn't be rescheduled. My mother noticed. She didn't say much, because that wasn't her way, but she noticed. When she passed, she left the house to both of us equally. A semi-detached in Etobicoke, paid off, assessed at around $640,000 at the time. It wasn't a fortune, but it was solid. It was hers, and she had wanted us both to have a piece of it. What she also left, and what nobody paid much attention to, was a storage unit. A 10 by 20 unit, at a climate-controlled facility out near Brampton. She'd been paying the monthly fee for years. The key was in an envelope in her desk drawer, and the envelope had my name on it, just mine. My brother-in-law decided this was an oversight. He came to the house 3 days after the funeral, with a folder of printed documents, and a real estate agent I had never met. He sat across from me at my own kitchen table and explained, in the patient tone he used when he thought he was being generous, that carrying 2 properties was inefficient, that the market was strong right now, and we'd be leaving money on the table if we waited. That Dana had already agreed it was the sensible thing to sell. I asked if this was what Dana wanted or what he wanted. He said those were the same thing. He slid the listing agreement across the table. He had already filled in the asking price. He had already scheduled a photographer for Friday. I told him I needed time to think. He said there wasn't much time to waste. I signed nothing that night, but I didn't fight him either, because I was exhausted and grieving, and I didn't have the energy to explain to a man like my brother-in-law what it feels like to sit with your mother through the last months of her life, and then have someone arrive 3 days later with a folder and a timeline. I told him I would look at the documents. He left the folder on the table when he left. He did not say thank you. He did not ask how I was doing. He stopped in the doorway and said, "Don't wait too long, Rachel. The spring market is going to be competitive." That night I went to my mother's desk. I found the envelope with my name on it. Inside was the key to the storage unit, and a handwritten note, just 5 lines long, in her careful, slightly slanted handwriting. The note said, "I've been putting things away for years. I never told anyone because I didn't want the fuss. The unit is paid through next December. Whatever is in there is yours. I trust your judgment, sweetheart. Always have." I held the key for a long time. I thought about the lamp Dana had carried out under her arm. I thought about the folder on the table and the photographer coming Friday. I thought about my mother sitting in the passenger seat of my car, pointing out the Tim Hortons where she used to take us on Friday afternoons when we were small. Her voice so ordinary, so present, and then 3 weeks later she was gone. I put the key in my coat pocket, and I went to bed. I drove out to Brampton on a Saturday morning in late November. The 401 was moving well for once, and the sky was that particular flat gray that means winter is not coming. It has already arrived and unpacked. The storage facility was a clean, institutional building on the edge of an industrial park, the kind of place that tells you nothing from the outside, The woman at the front desk looked up my mother's account. She said the unit was in good standing, and she was sorry for my loss. She gave me a paper to sign, transferring the account to my name, and I did. And then she handed me a badge and pointed me down the corridor. Unit 114. It was at the far end of the building, around a corner, slightly separate from the main row of units. I noticed the hallway was cooler here, more carefully maintained. There was a small humidity gauge mounted on the wall outside the door, the kind you see in wine cellars or instrument storage. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. It was dark inside. I reached for the light switch, and the fluorescence hummed on. I stood in the doorway for a moment, not understanding what I was looking at. Then I started to understand, slowly, the way you understand something when your brain refuses to accept it all at once. The unit was full. Not crammed or cluttered, but carefully, deliberately full. Things had been arranged, sorted, wrapped, labeled in my mother's handwriting on masking tape. Along the left wall, stacked in archival boxes, documents, decades of them, family records, property certificates, tax filings going back to my grandparents. In the center of the room, covered in padded moving blankets. Furniture. Not ordinary furniture. My grandmother's writing desk. A hall table with carved legs that I had sat under as a child pretending it was a fort. A rocking chair my great-grandmother had brought over from Portugal. But it was the back wall that stopped me. Mounted on a custom rack, wrapped individually in acid-free tissue paper and archival sleeves, were paintings. I counted them. There were 14. I am an accountant. I am not an art historian. But I know enough about my family to know that my grandmother had been a serious collector in the 70s and 80s. Back when collecting meant haunting estate sales and building relationships with small galleries and understanding what you were looking at before anyone else did. She had talked about it sometimes, in the offhand way that people talk about a hobby, never as if it were significant. My mother had never mentioned keeping any of it. I walked to the back wall. I lifted the edge of the tissue paper on the nearest sleeve. The painting underneath was small, maybe 14 by 18 inches, oil on board, a landscape with a figure standing at the edge of a lake. In the lower right corner, initials and a date. I knew enough to recognize the style. I had seen work like this in textbooks. My hands were not entirely steady. I pulled out my phone and I called the only person I knew who might be able to tell me something useful on a Saturday morning. His name was Tom. We had worked together 2 years earlier, on an estate audit for a client, whose family had, it turned out, wildly underestimated the value of a collection of mid-century ceramics. Tom had the kind of methodical patience that made him very good at knowing what things were actually worth, as opposed to what people assumed they were worth. He answered on the third ring. I told him what I was looking at. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Can you send me a photograph of the signature on that first piece?" I took the photo and sent it. He was quiet for longer this time. Then he said, "Rachel, where exactly are you right now?" I told him. He said, "Stay there. I'm coming out." He arrived just over an hour later. He was wearing his weekend clothes and carrying a small case with magnifying tools and reference materials and the calm, focused expression of a person who has learned not to show excitement until he's certain. He spent 40 minutes going through the paintings. He checked the signatures, the canvas backs, the framing materials. He cross-referenced 3 of them on his phone using auction databases I didn't have access to. He didn't say much while he worked. I stood in the corner and tried to keep my breathing even. Finally, he turned around. He said, "Your grandmother had very good taste and apparently very little interest in talking about it." He said, "I can't give you final numbers without a proper appraisal. But conservatively, 3 of these alone are going to come back at significant value. There's one here," he pointed to a piece in the far corner, an abstract, larger than the others that I think is going to surprise you considerably. I asked him what considerably meant. He said he didn't want to give me a number until the appraisal was done, because he'd learned the hard way that early estimates could mislead people. But he said the collection as a whole, if it was what he thought it was, would likely be appraised somewhere north of $400,000. The fluorescent light hummed above us. I said, 400,000. He said, possibly more, depending on what comes back on the abstract. I sat down on a padded moving blanket and stared at the floor for a moment. Then I thought about my brother-in-law's folder. I thought about the listing agreement. I thought about the photographer coming on Friday to photograph the house that had been my mother's, and the spring market and the timeline and the pen being pushed across the table like it was already decided. And I thought about something my mother had written. "I trust your judgment, sweetheart. Always have." I picked up my phone and I called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia. She was a friend of a colleague, an estate lawyer who agreed to see me Monday morning on short notice when I explained the situation. I brought the envelope, the key, the note in my mother's handwriting, and the photo ID showing my name matched the name on the storage account transfer. She listened carefully. She asked several questions. She pulled up the relevant sections of the will on her screen and read them twice. Then she turned to me and explained something I had not fully understood. The house had been left to Dana and me jointly. That was clear. But the storage unit and its contents had been left separately. The note, combined with the account transfer in my name and the specific language my mother had used in the will's residual clause, created a solid legal basis for the storage unit, and everything in it to be considered my separate property. She said, "Has anyone else been to this unit?" I said, "Not that I know of." The key was in an envelope with my name on it, and I found it in my mother's desk. She said, "Good. I would strongly recommend you do not mention it to anyone until the appraisal is complete." I said, "My brother-in-law is pushing to sell the house quickly. He's already arranged a photographer." She looked at me steadily. She said, "You have the right to delay that process. You are a co-owner. Nothing happens without your signature." She said, "Let's make sure you understand exactly what you have before anyone else gets involved." The appraisal took 3 weeks. 3 weeks during which my brother-in-law called 4 times about the listing. 3 weeks during which Dana texted me twice to say she hoped I wasn't going to make this difficult. 3 weeks during which I went to work and did my job, and came home to the house that still smelled faintly of my mother's hand cream, and I did not say a word. I am an accountant. I know how to wait for the complete picture before I make a move. I know that the worst financial decisions people make are the ones made in a rush, under pressure, before all the numbers are in. I waited. The appraisal came back the Friday before Christmas. The collection was valued at $462,000. The abstract in the corner, the one Tom had pointed to, came back at $178,000 on its own. The appraiser noted it had been acquired in 1981, for what she estimated was a few $100s, and had not been publicly shown since. She used the phrase, significant, undocumented holding. My grandmother had bought a painting at an estate sale in Burlington for a few $100s. That painting was now worth $178,000. I read the appraisal report twice. Then I called Patricia and told her the numbers. She said, "All right. Now let's talk about your next steps." My brother-in-law called that same evening. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't mention it was nearly Christmas. He said the real estate agent was getting impatient, and the January market was actually better than he'd originally said, and he needed me to look at the listing agreement this week. I told him I'd like to meet in person. I said I had some paperwork to go over with both him and Dana. He said, finally, "I'll come by tomorrow." He arrived the next day in the camel coat he wore when he wanted to look like someone who made important decisions. He sat at the kitchen table in the same chair he'd sat in the night he brought the folder. He had Dana beside him. Dana looked tired. She had been looking tired since the funeral, and I had not known how to reach her through him. I sat across from them. I had a folder of my own. I said, "I want to talk about the estate, all of it." He said, "That's what we're here for. Are you ready to sign?" I said, "Not exactly." I explained about the storage unit. I explained about the account being transferred to my name. I explained about the note in my mother's handwriting, and the appraisal, and Patricia, and the residual clause in the will. My brother-in-law's expression went through several stages. The first was dismissive, the second was confused. The third was the one I had been waiting for, the particular tightening around the eyes that meant he understood something had happened that he had not controlled. He said, "Your mother wouldn't have excluded Dana from something like that." I said, "She left the key in an envelope with my name on it. The account was transferred to my name. Patricia has reviewed the will, and she's confident about the interpretation." He said, "We'll get our own lawyer." I said, "That's absolutely you're right." Dana looked at me. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "What was in the unit?" I told her. I told her about the furniture, the documents, the paintings. I told her about our grandmother's collection and the appraisal. I watched her face as I said the number. She said, $462,000. I said yes. She looked at her husband. He had gone very still. There is something my brother-in-law had never understood about me, and that I think about sometimes when I think about how all of this resolved. He had always treated me like the less consequential sister, the one without ambition, without assets, without leverage. He saw a single woman in a rented profession, living in a house she co-owned with his wife, with no obvious power in any negotiation he would ever care about. He had written me off so completely and so early that he never bothered to update the assessment. He never asked what I actually did at work. He never asked what skills I had built in 8 years of accounting and estate audits. He never asked why a woman who had spent the last 2 years of her mother's life organizing appointments and managing household finances, and reading every document that crossed the kitchen table, might be paying fairly close attention to what her mother left behind, and for whom. He signed the listing agreement the night he brought the folder over. That was the agreement to sell the house. What he had not read carefully, because he never read anything carefully when he assumed he already knew the answer, was a clause my mother's original lawyer had included in the co-ownership arrangement. a clause that said any proceeds from the sale of the jointly held property would first be applied to any outstanding obligations owed by either co-owner to the estate. My mother had lent me money once, when I was 24, and needed help with a car repair and a gap between jobs. $1,200. I had paid it back within 6 months, and we had never discussed it again. My brother-in-law had borrowed $45,000 from my mother 3 years before she died, for a business venture that hadn't worked out. It was documented. It was in the records in the archival boxes in the storage unit. My mother had recorded everything. That loan had never been repaid. When the house sold in March for $680,000, the estate lawyer applied the outstanding loan balance against my brother-in-law's share before distribution. It wasn't the $462,000 from the collection. It wasn't a dramatic reversal in a single moment. It was quieter than that, and more complete. It was the way my mother had always operated, carefully, deliberately, with everything written down and filed and trusted to the right person at the right time. I kept the abstract painting. The appraiser said I could get close to $200,000 at auction if I was patient and marketed it properly. And Tom agreed. But I hung it in the living room of the house I bought with my portion of the sale. A 3-bedroom in a quiet part of Hamilton with a backyard and a kitchen that gets the morning light. And I look at it sometimes and think about my grandmother standing in front of it at an estate sale in Burlington, decades ago, knowing something other people had missed. The furniture is in the house too. The writing desk is in the spare room. The rocking chair is in the corner of the living room, near the window. The lamp from my mother's nightstand, the ceramic one Dana had been carrying out under her arm the night she met me at the door, turned out to be part of the documented household inventory in the estate. It came back to me through the formal distribution process. It's on my nightstand now, just where it belongs. Dana called me in April. It was the first time we had spoken without lawyers or paperwork between us in almost 6 months. She sounded like herself again, or closer to it. She asked if we could have coffee sometime. I said yes. I meant it. I didn't say what I had thought about during the long months of waiting and accounting. And careful, quiet patience. That the hardest part of all of it was not the legal process, or the negotiation, or even my brother-in-law's particular brand of dismissive certainty. The hardest part was watching my sister stand beside him in my mother's kitchen and say nothing. But I have learned, in 8 years of looking at other people's financial records, and the stories those records quietly tell, that people's choices make sense when you know what they've been told about their own value. My sister had been told, for a long time, by someone she trusted, a version of herself that needed him to manage things. That story takes time to undo. I am not in a hurry. I have my mother's patience and my grandmother's eye for things other people have decided aren't worth looking at. It turns out that combination is worth quite a lot.